The boardroom was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, and then his voice cut through it like a blade. The CEO leaned back in his chair, fingers laced behind his head, wearing that smug grin I had seen too many times before. He said, "We've decided to let you go. Your role is redundant." He didn't even blink. Years of work, nights spent fixing his mistakes, weekends I gave up for his last-minute demands, all dismissed in one flat sentence. I sat there, hands pressed against the polished table, fighting the urge to show how much it stung, because I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the look in his eyes. Cold, detached, like I was a tool that had served its purpose and could be tossed aside without a second thought. He went on with his corporate script, the same empty phrases I had heard him feed to others before me. Restructuring, shifting priorities, for the greater good of the business. None of it mattered. We both knew the truth. I wasn't being fired for performance. I was being removed because I had become inconvenient, because I knew too much about how the machine really worked behind his polished image. I knew about the deals that skirted the law, the investor reports padded with numbers that never matched reality, the people he bullied until they cracked. He thought I would walk out quietly like all the others, pack my things, and disappear into the background. But as he spoke, I felt something settle in me. Not panic, not grief, but a cold, steady focus. He had just handed me the reason I needed to stop protecting him. When I left his office carrying that cardboard box, the weight wasn't in the books or the photo frames, but in the humiliation pressing against my ribs. The elevator ride felt endless, my reflection staring back with a mix of anger and disbelief. I thought about how many times I had defended him, convinced myself that loyalty would eventually matter, only to realize I was just another disposable pawn in his game. I thought about the cars he drove in every quarter, each one more expensive than the last, while he cut costs so deep that teams drowned in double workloads. And I thought about how blind I had been to believe he'd ever care about anything beyond himself. As I walked past reception, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass walls, laughing with the CFO, pouring himself a drink like firing me had been a minor errand. My jaw clenched, and in that instant, something hardened inside me. I knew I couldn't let this end here. I couldn't let him walk away clean, while I carried the bitterness like a scar for the rest of my life. He had made too many people feel powerless, blindsided, broken. This time, he needed to feel it. And as I dropped the box into the trunk of my car, hands shaking with fury, I already sensed the ending of this story. I didn't know how yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. He was going to regret underestimating me. The days after I was fired blurred together, but not because I was lost or confused. I wasn't. I knew exactly what had happened, and that clarity made everything sharper, almost unbearable. Each morning, I'd wake up at the usual time out of habit, expecting to check emails, attend calls, fix fires before they spread. Instead, my laptop sat shut on the desk, my phone silent. The silence should have felt like freedom, but it didn't. It felt like I had been erased overnight. My whole routine, years of discipline and grind, cut short with the stroke of one man's pen. And no matter how much I tried to brush it off, the image of his grin the moment he told me I was redundant replayed in my head like a loop I couldn't escape. The anger grew heavier each day. I started remembering the small humiliations I had swallowed over the years. The meetings where he dismissed my ideas only to pitch them later as his own. The times he tore into me in front of others just to remind everyone who held the power. The holidays he ruined with sudden, urgent projects that always turned out to be about saving face with investors. It wasn't just one firing. It was years of quiet submission exploding all at once, years of believing that if I kept my head down, I'd be rewarded with respect or at least stability. Instead, I was left with nothing but a cardboard box and the gnawing realization that I had wasted loyalty on a man who saw me as less than disposable. The breaking point came a week later when I met with a few old colleagues at a bar. They had been shaken by my firing, not because they didn't see it coming, but because they knew it could have been any of them. One of them leaned in after a few drinks and whispered, "He's planning something big with the investors, something shady. You didn't hear it from me, but you'll see. He's going to ride it out and leave everyone else holding the bag." The words sank into me like ice water. It wasn't just about me anymore. He wasn't going to stop. He would gut the company, cash out, and leave everyone else to deal with the wreckage. And the thought of watching him walk away richer while everyone else was left scrambling made my blood boil in a way I had never felt before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city outside my window, and I realized I had a choice. I could swallow the humiliation, look for another job, and try to rebuild my life quietly. Or I could do something that would make him feel the same crushing weight he had dumped on everyone else. I could make him answer for the arrogance, the lies, the destruction he left in his wake. For the first time since that boardroom meeting, I felt my pulse slow, steady, almost calm. Because the decision had been made. I wasn't going to move on. I was going to make him pay, and I was going to do it in a way that he would never see coming. The first thing I did was stop yelling at the ceiling and start listing facts on a legal pad. Every single item I could remember that proved the pattern of how he operated. And I wrote until my hand cramped because anger without a map is nothing but heat, and heat burns out fast. What I needed was a map, and the map began with emails, dates, names, numbers, and small, verifiable details that would not look like the bitter ramblings of a fired employee, but like the scaffolding of a real problem. And I treated the page like evidence even before it was evidence. I began quietly making calls to old allies inside the company, not in the foolish, triumphant way he might have expected me to do if I'd walked in shouting and burning bridges, but in the slow, careful way of someone who knows how fragile trust is and how dangerous loose talk can be. I said things like, I don't want to drag anyone into this who doesn't want to be dragged in, but if what I think is happening is true, we need to document it. And I let them talk, and as they talked I took notes, because people soften when they are allowed to say the things they have been holding back in secret, and the small confirmations I got. Offhand remarks about numbers that didn't add up, mentions of off-book vendors. The name of that private meeting where the CEO told a select few to manage expectations with certain clients became threads I could pull. I didn't rush to the press, I didn't post a venomous thread on social media, and I certainly did not engage in anything illegal. Instead, I built a timeline and a trail, and the trail began with the things I could prove with documents I had legitimate access to from my tenure. Things like draft financial models, a folder containing emails where proposals were edited in ways that changed the meaning of contractual obligations, and internal Slack threads where senior leaders joked about creative reporting. And I made exact copies of those files onto a personal hard drive in the privacy of my apartment, because you do not hand fragile leverage to someone who fired you without securing it first. And while some might call that obsessive, the clarity it gave me made every subsequent step cleaner. I hired a lawyer for an hour to ask boring, careful questions about whistleblower protections and about the exact legal channels for reporting fraud and misrepresentation to investors and regulators. I told him nothing of my feelings and everything of the facts, because in these fights emotion is the enemy of credibility and lawyers translate messy truth into the clean language of procedure. And he explained things in a way that made me feel less like a man preparing for a brawl and more like someone preparing to present a case. When I met with former colleagues, I never started with accusations. I started with observations and then invited them to add what they had observed. And once they began, they didn't stop, because the company had been choking on silent collusion for years, and I had accidentally given them a space where it was safe to breathe. One of them said to me in a crowded diner while stirring his coffee, as if the movement could hide his real agitation, I kept the copies of his slides because they looked off. And I have the emails where he told us to massage the forecast just a bit before investors came in. And I listened to that, and I wrote down the sender, the recipient, and the dates. Another said, if you want to do this, we can make a list of witnesses and documents, but we have to protect ourselves. This man will burn anyone who appears disloyal. And the way he said it made me feel less alone because it confirmed that the problem was systemic, not personal theater. I set rules for myself and for anyone who would join me. We would not destroy anything. We would not fabricate anything. And we would not break into servers or hack accounts. We would rely strictly on what legitimate access and memory provided. And we would place everything through channels that made our claims hard to dismiss as sour grapes. Once I had a stack of corroborating documents and a half-dozen colleagues who agreed, in whispering tones, to be ready to confirm details if someone official came knocking, I started quietly reaching out to people outside the company who had a stake in the truth. I called one investor contact I had met at a conference the previous year and said, "I have something you should know about that company you've been watching closely, and I'm not calling to get hired back or to start a fight. I just want the numbers to be right." And I let him ask the questions he wanted to ask, because powerful people respond to facts and timelines more than to fury. And when he said, "If you can send me what you have, I'll look into it," I felt a cold, careful satisfaction that was nothing like revenge in movies, but much more dangerous because it was real. I also reached out to a small investigative reporter I had once helped with a background detail for an unrelated story. I didn't offer melodrama. I offered documents and context, and I suggested a narrow, verifiable angle that wouldn't play as a smear, but as a public interest story. That a CEO had been communicating results in a way that materially misled investors and squeezed employees to make the numbers look right. There were nights when the plan felt like an operation and not like me at all. I sat in my kitchen under the hum of a cheap lamp, reading emails I had once sent in the innocence of a job, and now parsing them for the exact parts that would show intent, and I rehearsed how I would speak to an investigator without sounding bitter, because bitterness is a human luxury that gets you dismissed in formal settings. And I practiced lines such as, "Here are the documents. I did not take them to harm the company. I took them to ensure that the truth was available to those who need it." And I repeated that line until it felt like a calm promise rather than a justification. I set up secure email accounts, encrypted certain files, and documented the chain of custody for the copies I had made so that when the moment came there would be no gap any lawyer could exploit. To some people this might sound paranoid, but in the world of corporate power, paranoia is simply a translated word for prudence, and prudence was my armor. The other crucial part of the plan was timing, because timing is what separates a temper tantrum from a disruption. I watched the calendar of investor meetings, I tracked the quarterly reporting timetable, and I listened to the rumor mill about potential acquisitions that, if announced, would drown our concerns in celebration and make the truth harder to hear. And so I chose a window where the board needed clarity more than it needed optimism, a small gap between the close of a funding round and the public filing where a quiet, factual report could force a review without becoming fodder for spin. I told my lawyer the exact dates, and we prepared a succinct packet that combined the strongest documents with an executive summary that would not read like revenge, but like a sober disclosure, because the legal world loves sober things and hates theatrics. And when my contacts within the company confirmed that they could corroborate if necessary, I began to feel the momentum shift from anger to method. And method is a kind of power that a man like him cannot easily intimidate because it speaks in the language of auditors, of compliance officers, and of the law itself. Finally, I prepared for the personal part of it, the calls I would make, the people I would warn that something would be moving, the small lies I would tell my sister about why I was working late instead of letting her worry, and I cleared my mind of the romantic notions of revenge people like to indulge in, the scenes of poetic justice where the villain's life crumbles spectacularly on camera, and instead I focused on the quieter victories, that the truth would be corrected in the public record, that investors would get accurate information, and that people who had been hurt by his decisions might have a shot at recourse, because I had no interest in destroying for the sake of destruction. I wanted a recalibration of reality, a moment where the costs of his choices were visible and where he would have to answer questions he usually made others answer. It was clinical, it was slow, and it was deliberate. The plan was not about his humiliation as much as it was about restoring a ledger of truth, and that, more than anything, is what made the work feel righteous to me even when I knew I should not use that word. I remember the morning I decided the plan would finally move from paper to action because the air in my apartment felt thick with the kind of inertia that only comes from holding a secret too long, and I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and opened the encrypted folder for the last time to check that every document, every email thread, every copied slide had a note, a timestamp, and a corroborating witness attached to it. And then I began the choreography I had rehearsed in my head 100 times until the motions felt less like revenge and more like a necessary procedure. I started by emailing the investor contact the precise packet I had prepared, subject line simple and clinical so it wouldn't trigger alarm bells to anyone scanning their inbox at a glance. And in the body I wrote, "Attached is a factual package that I believe materially affects the company's recent disclosures. Please review and let me know if you'd like more context." And I hit send without fanfare because everything I had learned in that job taught me that subtlety moves faster than bluster. Within the hour, his assistant called to schedule a call for the afternoon, and that call was the first domino. The investor asked methodical, pointed questions, the kind that make executives sweat when the answers are not clean, and I gave only what the documents proved. I framed everything as an appeal to correctness rather than an act of revenge, and I felt a cold satisfaction as he said quietly, "If this is true, we need to escalate to compliance, because once a compliance investigation starts, it brings auditors, lawyers, and the sort of scrutiny that doesn't care about charm or charisma." While the investor reviewed the packet, I contacted the reporter and provided a narrower, verifiable angle that could not be dismissed as hearsay. An example of altered forecasts and internal instructions to massage numbers ahead of investor calls. And I let him know I had witnesses willing to speak on the record and documents that supported their claims. And instead of dramatics, he asked for the specific emails and the names of people who could corroborate. And when I sent those, he said, "This is the kind of thing that should make the board ask the right questions." And I understood his meaning perfectly. A well-run board will not let an outside journalist dictate its agenda. But boards will react when reputable investors and reporters converge on the same uncomfortable facts. And that convergence was what I wanted. Between calls, I texted the colleagues who had agreed to stand by me, and I gave them a script for what to say if someone from compliance or the press contacted them. And I reminded them to keep their answers factual and brief, because long, emotional accounts get filed away as disgruntled ramblings, while short, factual confirmations carry weight in an investigator's report. That afternoon, the CEO called me out of the blue, and he sounded the way he always did when he wanted to thinly disguise control as concern, saying, "I heard you're speaking to investors and the press, and I need to understand what you're trying to achieve." And I could hear the polite threat behind every syllable, the assumed ownership of narrative that had given him power for years. And when I answered, I kept my voice even and my sentences measured. "I'm trying to make sure the truth is available to those who need it. I'm not trying to harm the company. I'm trying to correct misinformation." He pushed back, trying to paint me as a vengeful former employee, and he said in a tone that tried to be both fatherly and menacing, "You don't understand the consequences of making unfounded claims in public." And I responded with the calm that had come from weeks of rehearsing legal phrasing. "I only made claims where I could show the documents, and I'm prepared to provide those to any investigator or auditor who asks." The line went quiet for a long time, and then he said, almost conversationally, "You're making a mistake." And I answered, "Perhaps, but I did not make the mistake of believing that deceit was a sustainable strategy." And after that call, he did what he always did when things got risky. He buried himself in meetings and sent a flurry of internal emails about confidential matters. Signs that a man who had long relied on optics was now scrambling to manage optics of a different sort. Within 2 days, the investor called back and said they had initiated an inquiry and that compliance from their side would be reaching out to the company. And at the same time, the reporter told me he was preparing a piece but would hold publication for a few days to give regulatory bodies a chance to act. Because the last thing a responsible journalist wants is to publish a story that puts people at risk without giving authorities time to respond. And that decision felt like the quietest possible confirmation that the mechanism I had set in motion was working. It wasn't viral outrage or social media mobs. It was the deliberate, cold-moving machinery of people whose jobs were to ensure accuracy in finance and corporate governance. Then the calls began. A terse voice from the company's compliance team requesting a meeting to clarify some items. An email from the board's secretary asking if I would be willing to give a recorded statement to an independent investigator. And a call from one of my ex-colleagues who said, voice tight with fear and relief, they sent someone to my desk to ask about those forecasts. And I said I remembered being told to massage things, and they asked me to forward the emails. Each confirmation tightened the net in a way that felt terrifying and right at the same time, like pulling a rope that leads not to spectacle, but to accountability. There was, of course, the human friction you cannot predict in any plan. One of the colleagues who had promised to corroborate panicked when a senior partner from the law firm called him for a formal interview and confessed, in an anguished whisper, over the phone that he was terrified of being blacklisted in the industry and wondered if he had made the right choice. And I found myself making what might have been the most uncomfortable call of all, not to the CEO, but to my friend's partner too. Explain why he was doing the right thing, and to offer support in ways that had nothing to do with legal strategy, but everything to do with the reality that people's livelihoods and reputations were at stake. And together we put in place a plan to ensure that the colleague's testimony would be protected and that he would have counsel if he needed it. Because the plan I had built was not meant to destroy careers indiscriminately, but to expose a pattern and give people a chance to step out of it, without being collateral damage. While those personal matters were being managed, I watched the company's stock whisper downward in after-hours trading as rumors of inquiries leaked into the marketplace. Small movements at first, but meaningful enough to get the attention of the CFO who, for the first time in my memory, began sending long emails to the board with attachments labeled supporting documentation, rather than the usual optimistic decks he submitted before earnings calls, and when the board called an emergency meeting to discuss potential compliance exposures. I felt both vindicated and oddly hollow because the machine I had helped run now hurtled toward a reckoning I had not fully imagined. The most dramatic moment did not involve shouting or public spectacle, but a quiet meeting in a windowless room with two auditors, a lawyer from the investor's side, and an independent investigator who kept his gaze steady in a way that made me feel like a man in a courtroom, even though we were sitting in folding chairs in a conference center. And the investigator slid the packet I had prepared across the table and said, without emotion but with absolute clarity, "We will verify these documents and speak to the listed witnesses, and if they confirm, we will expand the inquiry." And when one by one the auditors confirmed that the emails contained language inconsistent with public filings, and the lawyer asked the CEO's counsel some questions that could not be answered without digging into legal exposure, I saw the CEO's composure crack for the first time in my life because he realized the rules he had bent for so long were not elastic enough to contain an external review from people who did not owe him loyalty. He tried to speak through his counsel, insisting that any differences were innocent or the result of miscommunication, and in the echo of that room I heard him say to his lawyer, almost pleading, "We can explain this away, we can spin this." And the lawyer, whose face was unreadable, answered, "We can try, but these are facts now, and facts have a way of behaving like evidence." The exchange was not cinematic, but it was precise, and precision is crueler than spectacle because it leaves less to interpretation and more to unavoidable consequence. By the time the reporter's article finally went live with a cautious headline and careful sourcing, a process that took longer than I wanted, but that ultimately preserved credibility, the board had formed a special committee to review the allegations, and the CEO was publicly defending the company while quietly meeting with his legal team in private, and each step forward felt like a small, exacting victory because it forced the story into spaces where charm and swagger were less effective than documentation and testimony. The execution was not a single triumphant moment, but a series of deliberate moves. A packet sent, a conversation had, a witness protected, a timeline confirmed. And when I last walked past the company building that week, not as a fired man, but as someone who had contributed to creating a very different kind of pressure, I felt something settle into the marrow of my bones that was not gloating so much as relieved, because the plan had worked the way I designed it, by converting personal hurt into a formal, verifiable correction of record, and by doing so quietly enough that the world could eventually make its own judgment without the melodrama I had once imagined as revenge. When the dust settled enough for a breathing space, the consequences arrived in waves that were quieter than the fantasies I had once entertained, and yet heavier in ways I had not fully anticipated. And the first thing that happened was not a triumphant scene, but a boardroom email announcing that the board had accepted the CEO's resignation, pending the results of a formal review. Language chosen by lawyers to sound less like an indictment and more like an administrative adjustment, and I remember reading it on my phone at a crosswalk and feeling the world tilt in a way that made my knees go soft because the man who had seemed invincible had been reduced to a paragraph crafted by counsel. There were also regulatory letters that arrived at the company address asking for documents and clarifications. And while those letters did not promise criminal charges, they did promise scrutiny in a way that would make future career moves, investor meetings, and public statements painfully complicated for anyone implicated. The reporter's piece ran with careful sourcing and a headline that did not scream vengeance but instead presented the facts in a manner that forced the company to respond publicly. And the response was a polished statement about commitment to transparency and internal review, which read like a script written to soothe stakeholders while the real work of auditors and lawyers continued behind closed doors. A few investors insisted on deeper audits, some negotiated corrective filings, and there were quiet conversations about clawbacks and compensation that I only heard about secondhand. But the cumulative effect was that the optics he had always wielded as armor suddenly felt brittle, because the armor was being examined by people who cared less about charisma and more about ledgers and sworn statements. There were outcomes that felt satisfying in a practical sense. Some internal promotions were reversed, a couple of compliance processes that had been habitually ignored were reinstated with external oversight, and a handful of employees who had been pushed out earlier were offered severance packages or brought back under clearer terms because the new board committee wanted to show demonstrable remediation. And while none of these things erased the years of being treated as expendable, they did create tangible corrections that helped some people recover financially or professionally in ways that were not symbolic but real. For the CEO, the career path he once walked did not collapse overnight, because that is rarely how these things move in reality. Instead, opportunities narrowed. Executive recruiters who had once called him routinely went quiet, and his public appearances were fewer. Each interview met with uncomfortable questions and the occasional curt reference to the investigation. And when, months later, some investors negotiated a settlement to avoid drawn-out litigation, the headlines spoke of agreements and non-disclosure terms rather than the dramatic courtroom scenes I had dreamed about. That lack of theatrical punishment felt oddly unsatisfying at first until I reminded myself that the point had never been to humiliate in the crude sense, but to force a correction of record and to create consequences that would make such behavior harder to repeat in that company and, maybe, in others. On a personal level, there were rewards I had not fully allowed myself to imagine. A couple of old colleagues reached out with job leads and offers that came not because they felt sorry for me, but because they respected the way I had handled the situation, with facts, restraint, and a focus on correcting harm rather than on vengeance. And those opportunities meant I could choose the next step rather than scramble for anything with a paycheck, which felt like a small reclamation of agency that was quieter than a headline, but more enduring. There were also costs I had to live with. Friends who found the stress of involvement too bitter and distanced themselves because being associated with a corporate scandal is risky even for the innocent. And I learned that loyalty has limits for people who have families to protect and mortgages to pay. My sister worried more than she let on, and I had to explain to her more than once why I was up late, why I could not share everything, and why the path I chose would likely drag on longer than any of us wanted. And those conversations were the parts of it that never felt like revenge at all, but like an expensive truth that required patience and quiet care. Emotionally, the aftermath was complicated in ways that surprise people who expect a simple victory lap. There were days when I felt a warm, almost private pleasure at seeing a correction filed or at hearing a colleague quietly confirm that a forecast had been restated, and that pleasure was not gloating so much as a sense of balance being nudged back into place. But there were other nights when I woke thinking about the faces of people who had been collateral damage in the scramble, employees who had been terrified during interviews or who lost reputation the moment their names appeared near the scandal. And I realized that any act that forces truth into the light will always have shadows, and those shadows had to be accepted rather than denied. I never imagined that doing the right thing, by which I only mean providing factual correction rather than seeking vengeance for its own sake, would leave me feeling both proud and unsettled, but reality, as usual, refused to be tidy. I had pushed a system to account for itself, and in doing so altered the lives of a dozen people in small and large ways, some restorative and some painful. And carrying that awareness made the victory less prismatic and more sober. When the story finally landed in professional circles, it did not make me a hero in the sweeping, cinematic sense. Instead, it made me someone people approached cautiously, and that was a better outcome than I could have guessed because it meant this had not been a show. Recruiters asked sensible questions about judgment and process, and when I explained what I had done, I found they were less concerned with the headlines and more interested in how I had documented things, how I had protected witnesses, and whether I could translate that discipline into building healthy teams that would not tolerate shortcuts. In quieter moments, I would walk past the office building and feel a strange, almost clinical peace because I knew the ledger had been nudged toward accuracy and because I had done something that matched the person I wanted to be in practice even when I was furious. And that mismatch between my earlier desire for dramatic retribution and the pragmatic, procedural reality I had created taught me something I did not expect. There is power in making systems work rather than simply trying to break. An individual and systems, once engaged, have their own inexorable logic that can produce outcomes far more consequential than a single moment of theatrical revenge. If there is one sentence I would allow myself at the end of all this, it would be this. I did not set out to be a crusader or a villain. I set out to stop a pattern that hurt people I cared about and to make sure the records reflected reality. And doing so cost me nights of comfort and some friendships, but gave me something I value more than public approval. The quiet knowledge that I acted in a way that turned humiliation into accountability rather than into bitterness. And that knowledge is not a clean or triumphant thing, but it is an honest one that I can live with.